Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for EarthSave Canada's virtual speaker series. I am Jen from EarthSave Canada, and today we are so excited to be joined by Dr. Lori Marino. Lori is joining us today from New Jersey, and we thank Lori very much for being here. I'm going to give a brief introduction before I turn it over to Lori. So Lori Marino is a neuroscientist and adjunct professor of animal studies at New York University. She's the founder and president of the Whale Sanctuary Project and executive director of the Kimmela Center for Scholarship-based Animal Advocacy. Lori's scientific work focuses on the evolution of the brain and intelligence in dolphins and whales, as well as primates and farmed animals, and on the effects of captivity on wild animals. She has published over 140 peer-reviewed scientific papers, book chapters, and magazine articles. Lori also works at the intersection of science and animal law and policy and is the co-director of the Animal Law and Science Project at George Washington University, as well as an adjunct faculty member at Vermont Law School. And today, Lori will be talking to us about big brains in tiny spaces, the effects of captivity on complex mammals. Now, just before I pass it over to Lori, I note that the plan for this session is Lori will be speaking for about 45 minutes, and we'll do our best to leave about 15 minutes at the end for your questions, which Lori will be happy to address. And if you post a comment or question on Facebook or YouTube, if you're watching live, you will be entered to win a $25 gift card from Vegan Supply. And with that, I will turn it over to Lori for the great presentation. Thank you, Lori, so much.
Thank you so much, Jen. Thanks for inviting me. And I'm happy to be here. And hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen so we can begin our presentation. Okay. I hope everyone can see that title slide. Today I'm going to talk about animals with big brains being forced into tiny spaces. In other words, the effects of captivity on complex mammals. And I'm going to focus upon two groups, elephants and cetaceans, meaning dolphins, whales, and porpoises. Now, just to give you an idea of the scope of this issue, if we look at captivity by the numbers, you'll see that there's quite a few elephants and quite a few dolphins and whales living in captivity. In the US and Canada, there are nearly 400 elephants held in zoos and circuses and breeding centers and traveling shows. And worldwide, there are about 15 to 20,000 captive elephants in zoos, circuses. In Asia, there are in temples and work camps. Now, regarding dolphins and whales in the US and Canada, there are over 480 bottlenose dolphins kept in tanks or lagoons, 60 belugas, 18 orcas, and a variety of members of other species held in marine parks and by the US Navy. Worldwide, there are over 3,500 whales, dolphins, and porpoises held in marine entertainment parks. So I want to frame what I'm going to tell you today with three critical questions that everyone should ask if they're interested in captive wild animal welfare. These questions work as a scaffolding for how one should approach the question of whether an animal should be in captivity. The first one is, who are you? Taking into account the species and the individual and their characteristics and evolutionary history. The second is, what do you need to thrive? Not just to survive, but what is it that you really need to thrive? And usually, if you look at the natural environment, you find what those animals need to thrive. And then the third critical question is, do you have the opportunity to thrive where you are? That is, in a zoo, in a circus, in a lab, or wherever you find yourself. So those three questions guide the overall question of captive wild animal welfare. My argument, based upon all the work I've done and others have done over the decades, is that, first of all, there are striking parallels in the effects of captivity on elephants and cetaceans, meaning orcas, belugas, and dolphins. And that's because they share a lot of characteristics that we'll talk about. But the second part of that is that because of their biological nature, elephants and cetaceans are not able to thrive in marine parks and zoos. There is a fundamental incompatibility between what they need to thrive and what zoos and marine parks can offer. And now I'm going to tell you the evidence for that. I want to look first at the brains of these animals because I mentioned big brains, and big brains, come along with sophisticated cognition and behavior. Let's take a look at the brains of an elephant, an orca, and a human. And just to orient you, this is the elephant brain, and this is the front, and this is the back. Here's the front and the back of the orca brain, and the front and the back of the human brain. So they're all on the side. And these images are not to scale. The elephant brain and the orca brain are about 5 kilograms, orca brain a little bit bigger. Our brains are about 1.3 kilograms. Elephants and orcas and other dolphins have brains that are relatively overly oversized for their body. And that's what this EQ tells you. For instance, African elephants have brains 2.3 times the size you would expect for an animal of its size. With an orca, it's 2.5. Some dolphins have brains that are 3, 4, 5 times larger than you'd expect for their body size. Humans have brains that are 7 times as large. And what does this tell you? Well, it might tell you something about how much of the brain is devoted to cognition and thinking and emotions as opposed to running the body. Now, the other thing that a lot of these brains have in common is they're highly gyrified. They have a lot of wrinkles on the surface. And that is an indication that over time, they've packed a lot of cerebrum, a lot of brain tissue into their cranium. So it is a measure of brain elaboration. These are also animals with tremendously elaborated brains in many other ways. Elephant brains have more neurons than us. Orca brain is the most corticalized brain on the planet, meaning that the part of the brain, the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex that's involved in thinking takes up more of the orca brain than it does in the human brain. So there are all kinds of quantitative measures that you can use to look at brain size and elaboration. But now I'm going to turn to the manifestations of those large brains, the characteristics of orcas and other cetaceans and elephants that tell us what they need to thrive. Well, one of the things they have in common is they're very large and they need a lot of space. They disperse and travel long distances on a daily basis in the wild. Their intelligence indicates that they need lots of intellectual challenges. They're self-aware, autonomous. They live in socially complex groups. They have very strong emotional family bonds. They have very long juvenile periods for learning. They have cultures that they pass on from one generation to the next, and very complex communication systems. So if you were to look at this list before you, this is a list of the characteristics that make a species incompatible with being in captivity. So for instance, elephants can travel over 50 miles a day. Orcas travel up to 100 miles a day and dive to incredible depths of the water column. They live in strongly bonded family groups with complex social networks. So each elephant and each orca and dolphin and porpoise has an individual role to play in his or her culture. They are not just a bunch of animals, a bunch of individuals together. When you see a group of elephants in the wild, or you see a group of dolphins or whales, you're looking at a community, you're looking at a culture with traditions that get passed on from generation to generation through learning. There's different dialects, different ways of doing things. Also, the emotional ties between mothers and their offspring are the strongest in nature. They're intense and long-term. And that's very much like it is with us. So elephant mothers have a lifelong bond with their babies, even when they grow up. And the same is true for orcas and many other cetaceans. They also, being large-brained, very self-aware, complex beings, grieve their dead. And we see multiple instances of various behaviors that occur when they are dealing with a member of their group who has died. On the right, in this case, a dolphin whose child has died, and she carried that calf around for a very long time. And they enjoy a challenge because you can't have a big brain like that and just sit around. You'll die of boredom and you need things to stimulate you. So in the wild, orcas, dolphins, they are challenged by different ways to get food. They cooperate and collaborate with each other. They navigate through the world. It isn't always easy to eat and hunt, and that's the way their brains and their bodies evolved. For elephants, the same thing. They love to find different tasty things to eat. And in the wild, their diet is extremely varied. So what do elephants and cetaceans need to thrive? This is it. They need personal space. They need exercise and the stimulation of travel to different locations. They need intellectual challenges. They need to raise their children within a strongly bonded family group. That's very important. They need to live in a complex social group. They need to practice their cultural traditions. And they need to make their own choices. In other words, they need to exercise their autonomy. So going to the third question, what does captivity offer elephants and cetaceans? Well, really, captivity offers nothing of what these animals need to thrive. If you just go down the list: inadequate space or overcrowding, barren, impoverished environments, no complex social networking, few challenges, artificial collections of individuals instead of multi-generational families, forced separations, mothers and calves, often social isolation, and forced performances and contact with trainers and the public. If you look at the space issue for elephants, this large green circle represents one of the smaller versions of an elephant range in the wild. But just to give you an idea or a perspective on this, in zoos, the amount of space that they tend to have is represented by this dark blue dot. So you can see just visually that the amount of space that they get in zoos, even the good zoos and even the accredited zoos, is a mere fraction of what they really need in order to travel, exercise, and experience the world. The same is true for orcas, beluga whales, bottlenose dolphins, and other dolphins and whales kept in captivity. The largest tank in the world is a mere fraction of the home range of an orca, for instance. And an orca in an average concrete tank in a marine park would have to swim around 1,400 times, round and round and round, to match the equivalent daily distance traveled in the wild. Of course, when you're living in a concrete tank, you could swim all you want, but there's nothing new to see. And it's very different from the experience of actually traveling in a straight line to see different things. Zoos and marine parks offer impoverished environments. They offer environments that have little to look at, little to do, no complexity, very barren, very much based upon the kind of environment that is needed in order to maintain the display. So dolphins and whales tend to be kept in tanks, concrete barren tanks. Maybe they throw rocks, a few rocks in there, and there's a couple of windows, and they're painted blue. There's nothing on the bottom. This is a monotonous, impoverished environment. And they do this because it's easy to clean that environment. But from the point of view of an animal with a brain like that, it is just incredibly boring. Same with elephants, too. They're given maybe a little bit more, but not much compared with what they have in the wild. And there are many forced separations and social isolation. On the upper left, you see Bella. She's a beluga whale who lives in a mall in South Korea. That's her life. She's alone, and there's nothing to do. And she's in a very, very shallow tank. On the bottom right is Lucy. She's an elephant living in the Edmonton Zoo. The Edmonton Zoo is in Canada, and it's cold there. So she spends most of her time all alone in an indoor enclosure that looks like that. There are few challenges, and natural behavior is thwarted. In other words, everything is made easy for them, but they didn't adapt to having everything made easy for them. Their brain, that giant complex brain, needs to work things out, needs challenges, needs to be stimulated. So here you see an elephant opening his mouth and somebody's throwing food in. Here's an orca opening her mouth and the trainer is throwing a bunch of fish in. This is so unnatural and so unlike how they actually feed in the wild. Here's a picture of a captive elephant who is trying to reach out with her trunk to pick a flower because she would normally eat flowers and different forms of plants in a natural environment. But here she's barely able to reach something that she wants to eat. And it's also the case that in elephant enclosures, a lot of the times, The trees and the foliage are electrified so that the animals don't chew on them. So you could look at an elephant in an exhibit in a zoo, and it can look really lush, but look closer because you will tend to see electric wires around the trunk. So to protect the plants from the actual natural behavior of the elephant. There are forced performances and contact with people. We're all familiar with the performances of orcas and dolphins at places like SeaWorld. And also these swim with dolphin programs, which are absolutely devastating for dolphins in terms of their health, their stress levels, and is very risky proposition for humans as well. And here we see an elephant giving rides to a bunch of kids on her back. All of this is, as you can tell, completely unnatural. There's nothing natural about any of these behaviors. So if you look at this, you realize that these are very smart, very complex, long-lived, highly emotional, cultural beings who evolved with a certain set of characteristics. You put them in an impoverished, barren environment with hardly anything to do, no challenges, doesn't resemble anything like the natural environment. You don't even allow them to have natural social relationships. Well, it is no surprise then that what is going to happen is that you're going to have effects. And those effects of captivity on cetaceans and elephants are devastating. And they're also pretty much the same because stress and the stress of captivity appears to cause the same changes in the brain and the body in all species. So what do you see in cetaceans and elephants in terms of the effects of captivity? Well, you see increased mortality rates. They die more often, lower survivorship. They don't survive as often as in the wild, sorry. Significantly shorter lifespan, we'll take a look at that. Poor physiological conditioning and physical problems. Diseases related to stress, we'll look at that. Immune system dysfunction. Behavioral stereotypies and other abnormalities. Hyperaggressive behavior, poor parenting, and social skills. So these are all the myriad of effects that captivity has on cetaceans and elephants and other big-brained animals. Here are some examples. One of the things that plagues captive elephants most is foot problems, because they are often kept on substrate that is not natural. They may be kept on pavement or concrete, and they stand for a long time, and that causes their foot pads to crack, their nails to get infected, and they end up often lame. And lameness is one of the leading causes of death in captive elephants. Here's an example of a healthy foot. Here's an unhealthy foot. These diseases of the foot and osteomyelitis, bone diseases, have become essentially epidemic among elephants living in zoos. 50 to 80% of captive elephants have foot ailments. We see infectious diseases. The biggest ones are tuberculosis and EEHV, which is a herpes virus. 12% of the captive elephant population has tuberculosis. That's really high. And EEHV is common, and it's the leading cause of death in captive calves. Both of these, TB and EEHV, are due to immune suppression from chronic stress. You see the same syndrome in dolphins and whales in captivity. Many of the infections captive orcas and other cetaceans succumb to are opportunistic infections. In other words, infections that would normally not bother one, pathogens that are not usually harmless, but they cause disease when your immune system is compromised. And we've published on this issue, showing that this chronic stress of living in these unnatural, impoverished conditions weakens the immune system, which opens them up to all kinds of systemic opportunistic infections. The number one cause of death in captive orcas is pneumonia, followed by gastrointestinal disease, meningitis, encephalitis, candidiasis, all kinds of infectious disease. Many of these incidents of death from an opportunistic infection are also exacerbated by the fact that they are typically prophylactically over-medicating them. So when they feed them every day, they tend to put antibiotics and antifungals in the fish and then feed the fish to the whales just to stave off any infections. Well, as you know, because we know about antibiotics overuse, that is a recipe for disaster, because once they get an infection, they're often not able to fight it. They are also drugged with anti-anxiety, anxiolytics, anti-anxiety medications like Prozac. So when you see them giving them fish, there's a lot of drugs in the fish. Here's an example of a stereotypy that we're all familiar with in captive elephants. And I'm just going to show this briefly.
Why do you start? What starts to make it there? Why do you start swaying?
It's just because they have nothing to occupy their time, so they try and fill it by doing a behaviour like that, and then it just becomes a habit.
Let's see, how do I get this back? Okay, so you saw that elephant swaying back and forth. That is very, very common, and that's called a stereotypy, meaning it's a repetitive behavior that doesn't have any purpose. We see this a lot in captive elephants. There's also a stereotypy that you see a lot in captive dolphins and whales, an oral stereotypy. Typically, orcas, beluga whales, dolphins who are living in concrete tanks repeatedly bite on the hard tank surface, on the gates, and on hard toys. And what happens is that they chew their teeth down to the gums. In this picture, you see the lower jaw of an orca, and you can see where the teeth were. But the teeth have been ground down and they have holes in them. They're drilled out in order to keep them from getting infected. 60% of captive orcas in the United States and Spain have fractured mandibular jaw teeth. 24% of them have extreme mandibular wear, meaning teeth like this. When you look at lifespan, it's very clear that elephants don't live nearly as long in zoos as they do in the wild. Here's a graph showing that in the wild, in Amboseli Park, they live to 36, in other versions of natural habitat, 42 is the average lifespan. The average lifespan for an elephant in a zoo is 17 to 19 years. Now you see, again, the same parallel lifespan statistics in captive orcas and beluga whales particularly. One of the main holders of cetaceans in marine parks is SeaWorld. And they've always maintained that the maximum lifespan of orcas is 35. This is absurd because free-ranging populations of orcas have been studied for many decades. The maximum lifespan of many orca communities is 80 to 90 years for females and 50 to 60 years for males. It doesn't mean they all live to that age, but to say that the maximum lifespan is 35 is just wrong. It's inaccurate. The fact is that captive orcas rarely live longer than 25 to 30 years. Most of them die in their teens and 20s. 92% of all the orcas held at SeaWorld have died by the age of 25. So you can see why they'd be motivated to convince you that the lifespan is 35. There's also very high infant mortality, and this is really interesting. When you look at, for instance, orca birth rates and infant mortality rates, in the wild and in captivity, they're about the same. So one has to ask oneself, in captivity, orcas are fed. They don't have to go for food. They won't starve. They have 24-hour veterinary care. There's no predators, there's no ships, no pollution. And yet the best they can do is an infant mortality rate that matches a natural environment. And this begs the question, what is killing them? For elephants, it's the same thing. It's even worse. Infant mortality in the wild is 5 to 9%. In zoos, elephant infant mortality is a whopping 40%. And this is why zoos are so desperate to try to bring in new elephants because they cannot maintain the captive population. So in conclusion, the science tells you that there is a fundamental incompatibility between what big brain complex animals need to thrive and what zoos and marine parks can offer them. So what do we do about this? Well, there are 2 steps that we need to take now in order to phase out the keeping of these incompatible species in entertainment parks. First, stop breeding. Just stop breeding them in captivity so that we don't create more individuals who are living in an unnatural, impoverished environment. And then also transferring those individuals who are healthy enough to authentic sanctuaries. Sanctuary is still captivity, but they are places where, unlike zoos and marine parks, it is made for the animals. The animals' life and the animals' welfare is the priority, not the visitor experience. And so that makes it a much better proposition. Sanctuaries exist in a natural environment. It's not an impoverished artificial environment. So there really is a qualitative difference between zoos and sanctuaries, even though we would like to get to the point in the future when we don't even need sanctuaries for animals because they're all living where they should be. There are 3 or 4 operating elephant sanctuaries in North America. One in Tennessee, there's one in California. The Global Sanctuary for Elephants is in Brazil, and there's another one in the state of Georgia, I believe. In terms of sanctuaries for dolphins and whales, those are just coming online. And I've been working with two other efforts. So our organization is the Whale Sanctuary Project, and we're creating a sanctuary, an ocean sanctuary for orcas and beluga whales in Nova Scotia. We also are working with Sea Life Trust, and they have a sanctuary that they are completing for belugas in Iceland. And the National Aquarium in Baltimore is creating a sanctuary for their bottlenose dolphins that they would like to transfer from the concrete tanks to an ocean environment. And I just want to kind of end with showing you what our goal is, what our vision is for sanctuary for these kinds of animals. This is an artist's rendition of what our sanctuary in Nova Scotia will look like once it's completed. We will have a net that surrounds over 100 acres of water, continuous with the ocean. We will have veterinary care and feeding them, and we'll take care of them because they don't know how to take care of themselves. But they'll be in ocean where they can chase fish, explore other animals and plants on the bottom, feel ocean waves, and essentially regain their autonomy, do what they want to do on an everyday basis. And there's plenty to explore. So we are working this year very hard because we are fast tracking our development in the hopes that we can bring some residents to our sanctuary next year. And currently, we are working to see if we can bring 2 orcas who are living in France right now in a concrete box to our sanctuary next year. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about that. So that's what I wanted to say. It's sort of a whirlwind tour of why certain animals should not be in zoos and aquariums. And if you want more information, just check us out at thewhalesanctuary.org or send me an email, and I'm more than happy to chat with you. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lori. That was very educational, also very heartbreaking, to see some of the images and the video that you shared. And maybe I can just ask you, I apologize if this is a personal question, but you being a person who spends your days researching and thinking about these issues, how do you cope with that?
Sure, you wake up and who knows what you're going to find. How do you cope with dealing with animal abuse and exploitation and death and trying to change that? I think you cope with it well, I cope with it by just getting angrier about what's going on and wanting to do more, and doing something really, really helps to dissipate all of the anger and the sadness and burnout and all of that. Is just sitting down and do something for the cause, and it helps me.
That's and let's talk about that a little bit. So I wonder if you could speak about what people can do to help if they're interested in this. And I think there's 2 pieces to that question. One is if somebody wants a career in of the type that you're doing, how would you suggest they go about that? And then for those of us who are not going to be renowned animal researchers like you, is there anything regular people can do to help out here?
Well, thank you for the question. There's all kinds of things. I mean, of course, if you want to study animals, best thing is to get the best higher education you can. And don't necessarily think that if you start off one way that you'll end up another way. I mean, I didn't go into college thinking I want to study dolphins and whales. That came later. And so don't be afraid to see what catches your attention and go with that. But But, there's many things you can do. You can volunteer for different nonprofit organizations that are working to protect animals. You can do things like educate your friends and your family about what is going on in these facilities and what these animals endure. You can share information on websites. So there's so much that you can do and be an active participant in helping the animals. You don't need a PhD to do that.
That's great. And you mentioned that you didn't start off with this career path. So what inspired you to get into this?
Well, I've always been interested in the brains of animals and what it's like to be a member of another species. So, but it wasn't until graduate school. I mean, I studied a lot of different animals and studied primates and rats and all kinds of animals. But it wasn't until graduate school that I happened to come across a picture of a dolphin brain in a book in the library. And this was at a time when people actually went to the library and got books down off the shelf and opened them up. And there was a dolphin brain. I was just so amazed and fascinated by it. I said, gee, that is something I could study for a very long time. And that's how I got into studying dolphins and whales, not from the marine biology end, but from the neuroscience end.
Wow. So you never know what's going to spark something when
Well,
you
exactly.
go to a library.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I'm going to go now to a few questions about the substance of your presentation. The first one is, so you focused obviously on elephants and dolphins, but I'm wondering if, and the difficulties they have in the captive situations we put them in. But my question is, does everything you're saying sort of apply equally or to some extent to smaller animals? And let me give you two examples that come to mind. One
Sure.
is rats.
Yeah.
They're, kept in small cages and so on, but we know they're very intelligent and they have complex social relationships as well. And then the second one that comes to mind, because you mentioned the issue of separating mothers and babies, is dairy cows. So we know that on dairy farms, when a calf is born, usually the calf and the mother are separated right away. And we know that there's a lot of indication that the mother suffers from that process. She'll fight and grieve over the loss of her calf and so on. So, is what you're talking about really special to dolphins and elephants, or is that just kind of the most extreme example of something that probably applies across the board?
I think it's the latter. Everything I'm saying applies to other species. I did a lot of work reviewing the scientific literature on farmed animals, pigs and cows and chickens, sheep. And people think that animals in factory farms are not especially intelligent, don't care whether they live or die, don't love their kids, and they just write them off because it's easier to do that. But there's nothing that could be further from the truth. They suffer a great deal in these circumstances. And yeah, rats in laboratories, what I talked about today was one of the most extreme versions, but the same holds also for big cats, for primates, giraffes, other ungulates, reptiles. When you think about it, under what circumstance would any animal do better in an artificial environment than the one that they spent millions of years evolving in? We cannot improve on nature, and that's why they suffer. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Okay, now we got lots of questions coming in now. Okay, next one is, are conservation efforts the same as sanctuaries?
Well, not at face value. So conservation efforts are ways to protect and promote and support animals in the wild. right? The communities, species, at that level. Sanctuaries, the kind I'm talking about, are there to provide a better life for individuals. And individuals will come from captive situations. So they're not quite the same. Where they meet is in terms of what they represent, in terms of how we view other animals. So if you go to a sanctuary for elephants, or if you go to Africa and you see conservationists working for elephants, both of those might look different, but they are both all about changing our perspective about other animals and respecting them. You cannot see an animal doing tricks and think that that's okay and conserve them in the wild. They are connected in more ways than you think.
And of course, there's a variety of different organizations, claiming to help animals in various ways and asking for money. How would you suggest people go about evaluating, what is a good organization? Like it's hard to know, right? Unless you physically visit. What do you recommend people do to decide, if they want to donate some money, where should they put that money?
That's a really good question. So for instance, there are a lot of zoos and marine entertainment parks that call themselves sanctuaries, but they're not. And there are some questions you can ask yourself to tell the difference right away. One is, if they breed animals or if there are baby animals there, it is not a sanctuary, it is a zoo. If they allow you to touch the animals or swim with the dolphins or do any of that stuff, it is not a sanctuary. So those are two things right away that allow you to know the difference, no matter what they say they are. But there's also many other things that distinguish authentic sanctuaries from zoos and marine parks. And you can look for accreditation by the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries. You can look at GuideStar, which is a way to tell if they're on the up and up in terms of how their finances are handled, and ask around. And it should be all about the animals. Look on their website for what they actually do. It shouldn't be about them. It should be about the animals. Hope that helps a little bit.
And somebody asked specifically about African lion safaris. And, maybe that could be seen as better because the elephants have more space. I'm not sure. Would you have any familiarity with that and thoughts on that?
I've not been there. I know a little bit about it. I know that, yeah, the animals might have more space than in some zoos, but it's still a zoo. And a lot of the times the animals are kept indoors. They are not allowed choice as to where they go and what they do. So zoos, marine parks, entertainment parks may vary on various dimensions. But you shouldn't fool yourself into thinking that something that's called a park or a safari is anything other than a zoo.
Because the safari experience, it's designed to give the humans attending a certain experience, right? It's not designed to help the animals.
Know something like you're out in the wild, the animals are wild, you're on a real safari. It's not. But that's as far as I can go with that, because I don't know what their welfare record is, but I do know that they breed elephants, and I do know that is not a good thing.
For sure. Here's a quiz question for you. Where does the silverback gorilla fall in brain size. They are very intelligent, and it's disheartening to see them in captivity.
Yeah, so their brains, like the other great apes, the chimpanzees and the gorillas, the orangutans, are all bigger than you'd expect. About 2.3 to 2.7 times the size you'd expect for their body size. So they have very large brains for their body size. But some dolphins and whales have even larger brains for their body size.
Okay. When deceased elephants and whales have been studied and the brains have been studied, has anything different or abnormal been observed in animals kept in captivity in terms of the brain versus the wild, or is there any research on that?
Such a great question, and I wish I could answer it, but there's just not a big enough sample size. I've studied a lot of brains of deceased dolphins and whales, some in the wild, some in captivity, but in order to pick up those kinds of changes in the brain, you need a fairly large sample size, and it's just not there. Marine parks and zoos don't hand over animals that die on their watch. They don't like to do that. So it is very difficult to do that study and get enough sample size to actually see if there's something there.
Right. Okay. Maybe that's for future research.
Well, future research, although we hope that, I mean, in animals that are kept in laboratories, the sample sizes for these kinds of things can be in the hundreds. So, when we talk about changes in the brain, I will say that there's every reason to infer that the same kinds of changes that go on in rats, monkeys, other animals in impoverished conditions that we know about also occur in elephants and dolphins and whales, because we all have very similar brain structures that all do pretty much the same thing.
Okay. Next question is about Lucy. And those of us in Canada are very familiar with that story. Have you had any involvement in advocating for Lucy, or do you have any information on what's happening with her? And
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because tomorrow I'm going to be testifying for the S15 bill, which does provide some protections for elephants in Canada. And there are many of us who want to see that bill do the work of phasing out or ending captive elephants in Canada. And Lucy would be a really good candidate. Now, some people say she's not healthy enough to go to a sanctuary. And I don't know. That would require an independent level of testing and assessing her health in an unbiased way to really determine whether or not she could be moved to a sanctuary. It is certainly the case that her situation can be improved. And so, I mean, the fact that she is a single elephant alone is just, it's beyond cruel. The social lives of these animals is everything. It's like when you see one whale in a tank. That's the worst thing that could ever happen to that individual, because their social lives, their family lives are everything to them. That's what makes life worth living.
yeah, and it reminds me of solitary confinement for humans has been shown to be just extremely horrible for people.
That's why it's punishment, right?
Yeah, it's a punishment in that case. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same thing for these animals. These are highly social animals. They need to be with each other.
Okay, I want to get to your whale sanctuary project. Somebody has asked, will the whales in the sanctuary learn to take care of themselves, or do they stay there permanently?
They will be staying in sanctuary permanently, just like with elephant sanctuaries and other wild animal sanctuaries. They're not released into the wild because these animals don't have the capacity to survive unless they're fed and cared for. Many of them are born in tanks. They have nothing to go back to. So it's not like you throw them in the ocean and they know exactly what to do and they swim off into the sunset and everything's fine. No, unfortunately, they have to be cared for. And so in any sanctuary, dolphins, any authentic sanctuary, dolphins and whales are going to be kept for their lives. They may end up eating fish and learning a lot of skills along the way, but caring for them for the rest of their lives in a very large space in a natural environment is a really different proposition than trying to find a way to rehab them and release them into the ocean.
And I apologize if you mentioned it already, but how many whales could be housed there potentially?
Well, in our sanctuary, we could house some combination of 3 or 4 orcas and 6 to 8 beluga whales. And we have 100 acres, so that's a lot of space for them. It's orders of magnitude larger than the largest tank in the world.
It must be so expensive to do, and especially when you have to plan for so many years ahead.
Yeah.
Where does the funding for that come from?
It's all donations, private donations, philanthropists, some organizations, it's all donations. We have people who give $5 every month, and we have people who give 6 figures and more. And so everyone gives what they feel that they can, and it's all important.
Great. And if somebody wants to donate, maybe you gave it to us already, but where should they go online to
Just go to
participate
our
in that?
website, www.whalesanctuary, and you'll see donate button there, and you can, if you can't find it, email me, but can also go on our Facebook page as well.
Great. I think we have time for one more. In terms of what you've seen over your career, like these issues about dolphins and especially have been, these kinds of discussions have been ongoing for some years.
Yeah.
Have you seen any positive advancements as people have learned more about this?
I think people are more aware of, more sensitive to other animals' feelings. I think that they can't help but realize all the new information that keeps coming in daily about animals and other animals and how they're so much like us or we're so much like them. And that can't be lost on people. And I think people, obviously, they're much more aware of welfare for other animals. And I think that continues to happen. But we still have a long way to go. We still have a long way to go. And I would say that not everybody's the same. There are some parts of the world where captivity is being phased out, other parts of the world where it's ramping up. And that's just a cultural thing. And so you can't really speak for everybody. It just depends on where.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have. Lori, thank you so much. That was
My
extremely
pleasure.
informative. Yeah, very, very helpful. And look forward to staying in touch and following your work with the sanctuary and all of your other work as well. So thank you very much for being
Thank you
with us
so
today.
much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your questions. Bye.
Okay. Thank you. That's our speaker series for this time, and we will be in touch with the winners of our giveaway